Greetings and welcome to episode 56 of the Comic Watchers Show. I'm your host, Matt, coming at you from Oklahoma City. With me is Nicholas Osborne from Carthage, Texas. Nick, say hello.
Hello, everyone.
Hello, everybody. And missing in action this week is our newest watcher, Mike Eakins. He is feeling sickly. He said he has, and I quote, a symbiote crawling out of his nose right now. So, but we're not shorthanded because we're got back for a special one-night engagement only. The venerated Professor Cody Aloysius White coming at us from Hawaii. Cody, welcome back.
What's up?
All right. Well, hey, we've got a really cool show this week in honor of the CW's big Crisis on Infinite Earths crossover that kicks off on December the 8th. We are going to dive back into the original one and only Accept No Substitutes granddaddy crossover of them all, Crisis on Infinite Earths by Wolfman and Perez. But first, Nick, let's have some news.
Definitely, we took a couple of weeks break, so there are a few things, but I'll stick to what's current and what everybody's talking about. Aside from probably Stan Sakai's Usagi Yojimbo that I have to start with because I'm so excited for this. Grass Cutter debuts with an artist selection edition that's really awesome. Highlights a lot of his great work. The storyline is going to be available for the first time in that edition and sold exclusively through IDW. So something to look out for. But from the big two, DC has been crazy busy with announcements lately. The new superhero that's coming June 23rd of 2020 called Primer. And it's coming from acclaimed animation writers, Jennifer Miro from Star Wars Forces of Destiny, which is great. It's on Disney Plus right now. You can check it out. And Thomas Krajewski, who's from Buddy Thunderstruck, and artist Gretel Lusky. And it's going to be their first graphic novel in work with DC. And it's going to focus on Ashley Rayburn, who uses a set of body paints that, when applied to the wearer, grants them like this wide range of special powers. And, the mystery unfolds with who ends up with these body paints and how they use them. So it's going to be a cool character to look out for, but the art is what's capturing everybody. It's something you got to check out. It's super cool.
So it's Dial H for Hero, but with body paint.
We don't know yet, but it seems like something that could be original. At least they're kicking up new ideas. The other announcement, I guess, is Young Justice is going to recruit Naomi and the Wonder Twins in Young Justice number 12. That's going to hit stores January 8th, 2020. It's a Wonder Comics crossover, really. Naomi, the Wonder Twins, Young Justice. They're all going to confront the secrets behind the entire first year of the teen series. So it's going to be cool just to see them come together, and definitely going to blow up. So look out for that issue. And
I feel like they all need to come together to have an intervention for Tim Drake over his new code name, Drake. But that's just me. Just me.
They might need to address that.
Go on.
So DC, I'm excited for this. DC announced a new Walmart issue that eventually, like the others, I'm sure will hit comic stores. But it's the Crisis on Infinite Earths 100-page giant issue. And it ties into the CW crossover event. It's going to feature new stories from Marv Wolfman and Mark Guggenheim, who's working on the shows. And it's an in-canon story that helps to flesh out what we're going to see on the TV crossover. So I'm really excited for that. I mean, it's such a huge story that they could just keep telling it. And I think it's a great format for them. But swapping over to Marvel, a big announcement that just dropped is Strange Academy. So Doctor Strange has opened up an academy for young sorcerers. It's going to hit in March 2020. It's a new ongoing series from Scotty Young and Humberto Ramos. So it's going to bring a bunch of students from Earth, Weird World, Asgard, the Dark Dimension, and they're all going to hone their skills under the guidance of Doctor Strange, Brother Voodoo, the Ancient One, Scarlet Witch, Magic, and Hellstrom. So a lot of people are excited over this one, and I am too, but there are some comparisons to the Umbrella Academy. I saw the Daniel Way nod coming up a lot, and it's gonna be cool to see how they differentiate themselves from, that shtick.
And Hogwarts.
Oh, true. Right.
Elephant in the room, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, I mean, it looks really great. So I mean, I'm excited. This is obviously why Deadpool from Scotty Young ended with a short 12-issue run. So he's moving on to other things. But there's been a lot happening with Comic Watch. We've got first look exclusives of Fallen Angels #3. I had a lot of new trailers released over the past couple weeks. The big one, I guess, was Marvel's Black Widow. I'm unsure how I feel about the movie, but it looks cool. We'll see.
It looks like an MCU movie. I mean,
right.
For what it's worth, I'm sure it will be great in its own way. I don't think it looks like it's going to break away from any of their tried and true formulas. And I mean, hell, Black Widow's been deserving of a movie for quite some time now. So it's about time, regardless.
Right. It is overdue. So take what you can get at this point.
Don't forget about Classified X.
Oh, what is that?
The new upcoming X book coming in March 2020. Thus far, they've revealed Havoc, Psylocke, Scalp Hunter, Nanny, and Orphan Maker on the team. And Mr. Sinister, and there's a couple more reveals to come. It looks like it's the most chaotic thing in the world, and I'm totally on board for it. I don't know who's writing it. I don't know who's drawing it. Whatever. Give it to me.
Just pulling names out of a hat for X teams anymore.
Right?
This does pretty much confirm that Fallen Angels is done, with Psylocke being a part of it, or Quanon. Same now that moving on to that series, it looks like that is a mini series that was announced as something other. Classic Marvel swap. But yeah, it looks like a cool series. I'm excited for it. But other trailers we had were Disney's live action Mulan, that people has some controversy about too because of the history behind that one. But it looks pretty cool. I'm excited. I'm not as big a fan of the live action films, but they're worth giving a shot, I guess. New James Bond movie that's coming out is going to be the last of Daniel Craig's. That's pretty cool. And the big one is great transition. The CW Crisis on Infinite Earths dropped their last trailer, I believe, before the event actually starts on December 8th, Sunday, I believe. And the trailer was just epic. It's bringing in so many of these past characters, and they're showing them in the trailer. So, what have they not shown us yet? That's what I'm excited for. And that's pretty much it for the news.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Nick. Mike thanks you as well from his symbiote-induced coma in Virginia. Let's move on into it. In honor of the CW's Arrowverse crossover this year, Crisis on Infinite Earth, something they've been building up to since last year's crossover, when at the end the Monitor stood revealed amid the chaos. It's go time. Arrow specifically and The Flash have been very directly building up towards this all season long. And if you've seen this week's episodes, of course, I don't want to spoil anything yet, but they're gangbusters. And it's time. It's got me foaming at the mouth for it. But we want to go back and talk about the original series, Worlds Lived, Worlds Died. The DC Universe, and frankly, comics in general, were never the same again after Crisis came out in 85 and 86. It was, of course, written by Marv Wolfman with drool-worthy, legendary art by George Perez. And there's just so much that has already been said about this thing, but for those who are not in the know, a brief synopsis was during this 12-issue maxi series, DC basically blew up their entire universe. They condensed all of the multiverse into one world. They streamlined their history. They got rid of redundant characters, and they basically started fresh. There's so much more to it than that, of course, lots of nuance, but I really want to start with just a general, let's just take on the story itself, first of all. Nick, you're a little newer to Crisis as a reader. I'd kind of like to hear your impressions of the story first.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like I have somewhat of a unique perspective on it because I started reading comics digitally probably like 10 years ago now. And when you get online and search for what should I read about DC Comics or what are the essential readings, this is always at the top of the list. Crisis is what you should read as a DC fan. So I'm a young, naive reader thinking that that's what I should dive into first. So it was one of the first DC stories I read, and probably not much of it stuck. It was, it was a lot to take in. So going back through it this time, it was pretty much my first time. Like, so much of it made more sense, and I was able to grasp the scope of it and just what was accomplished here and the use of DC lore. But I believe that is the ultimate thing of this crossover, and that's what has stood the test of time, is the sheer expanse of what they took on with this story. And the overall purpose of it was to take this somewhat confusing timeline that had been built up pre-Crisis and condense all of these Earths down into one and make it, one cohesive timeline. And the narrative, I don't want to say hoops that were jumped through to get to that, but the storytelling elements that were built to create this situation is just brilliant. Even today, it stands up so well. I mean, as a somewhat newer reader, I mean, I'm going back through this on the DC Universe app, and like you said, the art is just drool worthy, but every issue I really couldn't wrap my head around just the scope of it, like how many characters were involved. And we're getting these important nods that actually contributed to the story, and they weren't just 2 pages of one-off stuff that you can ignore pretty much. They found a way to weave all these characters in such a just expansive way that was really epic, and it felt grand for the DC universe that they're treating these like almost gods. I've always loved that about DC Comics, that they have this sense where they are gods among men, and these are issues that men cannot handle. So, like, seeing what they do with it and the ability to take the classic superheroes and run them through this type of situation, unreal. Aside from the classic characters you get the Monitor and the Anti-Monitor. And the reveal, you get a few issues in before you get the Anti-Monitor reveal. And I think he's just hidden in shadows for the first 3-4 issues, maybe, before you get that big, epic, like grotesque looking face where it's like, this is the Anti-Monitor. That kind of character development, it's worth the wait. The anticipation of, just seeing the shadow figure, every single element in, it's not just an A and B plot line here. This is not that type of story. So every single element and every different plot line that comes up and weaves through this overall story is just so perfect, so magnificently done. And it's hard, to add things that haven't been said about it already and just overall praise. But the sheer fact that we're talking about it in the CW universe and how it can be applied to this storytelling medium, it just shows the quality of the story. Like, this is just powerful storytelling that translates really well over time and over different mediums. And I think it's touched on fundamental elements that work so well in both its character use and just overall lore building and world building. And they created something that really stood the test of time. So it really defines DC now, I feel like. This crisis and the ultimate struggle, it creates a generational legacy that the story just builds. I think you get that a lot with Flash. Big spoiler alert that they killed him off. But
33-year-old spoiler. Sorry, folks.
Yeah, big spoiler alert.
Okay.
I was watching on DC Universe, and they said that it effectively killed the Flash off for 25 years. And I had to ask, is that correct? Is that accurate?
Well, I mean, Barry Allen, yes.
Yeah, Barry Allen. I mean, the Flash that
Absolutely. they had. Barry stayed dead until the 2006 Flash Rebirth.
No, Final Crisis. Final Crisis number 2. He came back at the end.
I'm gonna fact check you on that.
Okay,
Ooh.
do it.
Because I think
Emo brought him back.
Because I think
Because Final Crisis precedes Flash Rebirth.
but I thought the All Flash one shot preceded that.
Now that I don't know.
So
I'll double check.
while Cody looks that up, the overall, I guess, purpose of Flash's death, I think, really touches on what the story in Crisis succeeds at so well in saying, this is a generational thing that they're creating. Somebody else steps into the Flash mantle, and now you have a whole new Flash for a whole new generation of readers. And this story sets that up for everybody. It sets up the DC universe for that.
You're absolutely right. And that generational legacy would eventually become a defining feature of the DC universe, for a while until they decided to put all the toys back on the shelf and get back to basics. But that's another conversation. But, and it's also worth noting that Kid Flash taking over that mantle, that was the first time a sidekick or legacy character had stepped into a role of a major hero. So that in and of itself is history making, and in and of itself. So I mean, and to your point, just as a series, like as a reader and as a reading experience, and you were saying that you felt like it held up really well. I'll tell you, upon my first time reading it, which was 15, 16, 17 years, early 2000s, I struggled a little bit with it in that regard, because Marv Wolfman is a quintessential Bronze Age writer, but he's very much a Bronze Age writer. And when you come into that as a modern and newer reader, it's just a different style. We have writers now have kind of evolved a better ear for dialogue and, less clunky exposition, et cetera, et cetera. And Crisis has a lot of that. And, you take it with a grain of salt. Obviously you as a newer reader, it didn't bother you, but I can imagine there's probably a lot of newer readers, myself included when I was younger, who kind of turned their nose up at that a little bit. And, like, well, Alan Moore could write much better dialogue than that. But, I'm a lot more well-read than I used to be especially on pre-Crisis DC. Yeah. And now I can go back and read it, and it's a perfect time capsule of its era in terms of writing. And all the characters, all these B, C, D-list characters, all the way down to freaking Space Ranger and Peacemaker, who? Oh, those people. Okay. They all get guest spots in it, and it's all these great little moments like that, all these nods and tips of the hat that are just reek of, and I mean that in the best way possible, of love for every weird little corner of the DCU. And I'll tell you, and I'm going to probably piss some Marvel fans off by saying this, but the embracing of those weird little corners is where DC stands out and stands above Marvel, because they are absolutely not afraid to lean into some of their niche characters or older, somewhat relative, quote unquote, passe characters, because they see that they all have inherent goodness in them and likability. And that stands really strong in Crisis. Like in a lot of ways, despite the fact that it was blowing everything up, Crisis is also this huge celebration of everything that makes DC great. And even though it looked incredibly different when it was done, the embrace and the love was all still there. So that's kind of a key takeaway for me from Crisis. Cody, what do you think of it? I know you've got some things to say. We didn't just bring you in for your looks.
Obviously not. First off, I think you might be right. It was hard to tell. The timeline's a little bit wonky when it comes to when issues came out back then. But back, that 2005, 2006 era. But I know. But I'm looking at all the titles and trying to. If you type in "Return of Barry Allen," then you get the old "Return of Barry Allen."
I got you.
It's a hard search.
Okay, all right.
But okay, so on to Crisis on Infinite Earths, right? And you kind of touched on this just a second ago, but what people kind of tend to overlook and kind of gloss over is, they look at it like, okay, DC is realigning everything and they're trashing a whole bunch of old stuff and they're trying to move forward. But Crisis isn't about destroying things. Like, Crisis is at its heart a love letter to the history of the DC universe and a love letter to the acquired properties as well. Like, that's a crucial element. Like, Peacemaker came over from Charlton and Blue Beetle and Captain Atom and the Question. All of those guys were brand new to the DC universe. You've got the Fawcett characters showing up and getting integrated for the first time. You had the Superman Shazam crossover at one point in the, late 60s, early 70s. But this is the first time that Captain Marvel becomes a part of the DC universe. So, there's so much love that Perez and Wolfman poured into this to be able to reach out to everything. Enemy Ace doesn't get any lines, but he's there. Haunted Tank is there. He even gets some lines. You've got Sergeant Rock and Easy Company. You got Little Sharpshooter and just the whole squad. Like, everything that DC has done for 45 years is showing up in this kind of homage to everything DC has done. Well, at the same time, they're planning to move forward, right? Because things needed to change. And this is a problem with comics across the board. They're always going to have these kind of problems when you have a shared universe. And I'll talk more on that maybe a little bit later in the show. But to me, this is the gold standard for how to operate a line-wide crossover. Everybody gets their moment in the sun. Everybody gets a panel at least to shine. The big guns don't actually end up overshadowing anybody. Like, how many major moments does Wonder Woman have as opposed to Blue Beetle or the new Dr. Light, who they introduced in this story. And that's the other thing, is they were not just realigning and destroying things, but they were also creating. Like, this was the biggest sandbox they could have put these two in. And we'd be remiss not to mention the late, great Dick Giordano and Mike DiCarlo, who also worked on this book. DiCarlo did most of the inks. Giordano did some. Anyway.
Had some credit in there, too.
Right.
I'm not sure where or which issue, but I know he's mentioned.
Well, of course he did. He had his fingers in everything at the time.
Damn right, he deserved it.
Yeah, no, I think Crisis is absolutely one of the most important moments outside of, like, Action Comics #1, Showcase #4. Like, this is probably the most important moment, and, like, Fantastic Four #1, right? This is the most important moment in superhero comics, is Crisis. And if you want, I can delve deeper into that. I'm afraid that I won't ever stop talking, but
I wouldn't.
I would like
I
to
don't want to
say,
start an argument there, but I will just say, for me, I would not put it above Amazing Fantasy 15. That's me, because that gives us the everyman hero, and that's a pretty important step. But
here's the thing: I feel like
I'm not sure.
not
I
just to
consider
play the devil's
advocate.
But, like, not just to play the devil's advocate. Everybody praising this story, it feels a lot like, before I got into comics, these are the type of stories you hear everybody talking about, and then when you read it, you're like, this is a lot. The strength of it using DC's lore is also what makes it not the best jumping on point for new readers or, somebody looking to get into DC Comics. It's overwhelming. And I feel like that's not something that's mentioned a lot. We love to see all these, like, random obscure-ish characters come in. And yeah, Wonder Woman and Supes get a lot of attention. Batman, not so much, oddly. I'll talk about that one later. But the story uses all of these obscure-ish characters and characters that aren't used a lot and builds up the DC lore and is a love letter to all things almost deep cut to DC. But when I read this, when I first started reading comics, that's what went way over my head. And that's a lot of the strength of this story. So I don't think that's a shortcoming of the story at all, but it is advanced reading. And I feel like somebody who's looking to get into comics, who, does a search and everybody's talking about how brilliant Crisis is, there's never a little bit of a warning that this is a lot to take in. It's a lot of information. It's a lot of characters, a lot of world building. And like Matt touched on
your shit.
A little bit. Like Matt touched on, the writing is, it's not clunky. It's, some Bendis type stuff happening where there's just a lot of dialogue and a lot of narrative building within that dialogue that's important, and it's tucked away on a small panel that you can easily miss. That is, the artwork's great, but there's so much happening on every single page that these books take a while for me to get through. I'm average about 15 minutes a book, and this one probably double that. Like, I would spend a long time going through these pages, and it can get lost, I feel like, in the discussion of how brilliant and awesome this story is, that it took me a week to read it. It takes time to get through this and to wrap your head around it. And know your shit. Don't just jump into this one cold feet or just not knowing what's happening in the DC universe.
But I think too, you've got to also understand that in 1985, these weren't deep cuts. Like in 1985, the majority of the DC readership knew who Sergeant Rock and the Losers were. Like, they were reading these books. They were reading Star Spangled War stories. They were aware of the Charlton characters from Charlton. They had just been migrated over to DC. Like, none of these characters were obscure. Kamandi had a series running. All of these series were getting ended for the new relaunch post-Crisis. But these were all the characters that the readers at the time were reading. Probably more so than Justice League, honestly.
Well, Justice League at the time was mired in the Detroit era, so
right,
you're probably right.
Right. All the leaguers, the important leaguers, were off in their own books doing their own things.
But it is interesting, Nick, that you point out how there's no one or at least one small group of characters that monopolizes the screen time. I mean, we're accustomed as modern readers to, Batman and Superman, Batman in particular, because he sells the most units, monopolizing the screen time in these types of stories. But everybody does get their moment to shine here. I mean, Black Orchid's flying around in the background. And what that does is it creates a broader narrative, or a story that is more narrative focused than character focused. And there's tons and tons of great character moments. For my money, Supergirl's death is so much more heartbreaking than the Flash's death. And I say this, I just reread both of these today. And I was genuinely surprised at how heartfelt the Supergirl death sequence is, and her eulogy afterwards. And then in the next issue, number 8, you get to the Flash, and it's just like, well, he got free, and now he is dead. And that's it. Well, he's a skeleton now. I mean, it just happened so quickly. And
oh, man. I totally disagree.
Imagine being it's a big moment. I don't want to detract from it. Just comparing the two. And they'd been telegraphing it since like page 5 of issue 1, so we knew something was coming with Flash. We just didn't know what it was. And of course, I'm sure in 1985, readers would never have guessed that Barry Allen was about to kick the bucket for 22 years. So,
right.
Credit where credit's due. This series did not shy away from those big character moments, but they were all happening in service of the greater narrative.
Right.
there's kind of a lull after issue 8 where you've got the 5 Earths hanging together, and everyone thinks that this is just the way it is now. The anti-monitor's gone away, everything's cool, and that's when the villains make their play, and they take over Earths 4, S, and X, and that winds up being the distraction that the anti-monitor needs to travel back in time to destroy everything from the start. So even these kind of side trips, so to speak, to fight villains across 3 worlds who outnumber the heroes 5-1, still work in service of lulling the heroes out of their, I don't want to say idle, but that's for lack of a better word. And you know what I mean? It all just flows, and even the stuff with Harbinger and Pariah, the 2 characters that, other than the Monitor and Anti-Monitor, that were created specifically for this series, those characters exist in service of the plot rather than the other way around, especially since these characters didn't go anywhere after Crisis was over. So everyone, the DC Universe as a whole is the star here. And that really is special, and it kind of sets this precedent. Now, we'll kind of get into that later in the episode of the DC Universe itself becoming a feature, because, and this kind of leads me to where, the second place I wanted to go with this discussion is the effects both before, what led up to Crisis, and the effects on the DC Universe and comics in general that it created afterwards, because this really is a definitive point in comics history.
Right.
Nothing like this had ever been done. I mean, Cody, do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so basically what you're dealing with is DC has created this multiverse of, multiple Earths, different properties on different Earths. And along the way, DC buys out Fawcett after they sued them into bankruptcy. Kind of a filthy move, but, whatever. The same thing happens with Quality Comics, which is where you get the Freedom Fighters from. Same thing happens with Charlton Comics, which is where Blue Beetle, like we've already said. So what they end up having is, not only do they have all of these multiple Earths, but they've got the major continuity problem of the golden age of heroes, then the flood of heroes in 1938 to 1942, who are overlapping the Silver Age eruption of heroes with, Hal Jordan and Barry Allen, and these newer versions of characters that we've known along the way, right? So, like, the only characters that continuously were published, Superman, Wonder Woman, Batman, all the way through. Everybody else got canceled, got pushed off to the side, got brought back in new forms later. So now all of a sudden you've got this paradox, right? And that forces Paul Levitz at the time, I believe, to come up with the notion of multiple Earths. So you get Earth 2, and that's where the Golden Age heroes are, and then Earth 1 is where the new Silver Age heroes are. Well, you can imagine that the chaos that starts to build. As all these other new Earths start coming in, you have more and more paradoxes piling onto each other, until you finally reach a point where DC's like, we got to do something. Something must be done here. Like, we have to organize this. And that's how Crisis comes about, where they say, okay, hey, Marv, you're killing it over here on Titans. Everybody loves it. George, everybody loves you. You guys work together well. We're going to put the ball in your court. Fix this. And they do. They manage to write a story that towards the end, you've got the 5 Earths that are left. Earth 1 and 2, which are the most crucial as far as the history of DC goes, plus the 3 Earths that contain all of their acquired properties that haven't been able to interact other than in crossover stories where you travel to another Earth. And they managed to take all 5 of those Earths, integrate them into one, crush the characters that don't fit, and rewrite history in a way that makes it so that they all coexist on the same planet in different timelines. And then they restructure the entire timeline. Like, History of the DC Universe comes out after this, and it's just like from Cavemen and Vandal Savage up through the Legion, like, here's how our timeline works. And as you can see, it's obviously something that needs to be revisited every now and again because we've had multiple crises. Legion of Superheroes Millennium is doing it right now. Like, this is something that just periodically needs to be done that Marvel refuses to acknowledge needs to be done. But we can talk about that later. But this was the first of its kind. They were the oldest. They were the last man standing of the original publishers. And they reached a point where they had to reorg to survive, to move forward, and to create something new. Otherwise, you just end up rehashing and rehashing and rehashing and crossing over. And it's a logistical mess. So, I mean, at some point, to some degree, this was for the editors. Help these guys out, tracking, literally infinite Earths. It can't be fun. Like, I imagine the murder board behind some of these guys' desks. Like, okay, who can we pull from Earth Prime to crossover with Earth 42? I don't know. I lost it.
Well, I mean, and not only that, but by the time you start getting into, the 70s and early 80s, these, especially Earths 1 versus 2, have very, very distinct continuities that have to be kept track of.
Right.
And that's not new reader friendly. And the accepted company line has always been that they wanted to straighten out their universe and make it more new reader friendly and accessible. And I accept that to a certain extent, but I'll also say that Marvel had started beating them in sales in 1971 or 72. And they never, ever got the lead again, except for like the odd month here or there. And I have to believe that part of them doing away with the multiverse was a direct attempt to make the DC universe look a little bit more like Marvel. And maybe not. I've never heard any hard proof of that. That's just kind of me thinking outside of the box a little bit. But, to really, really build on what you were saying, Cody, like DC's universes and myriad this, that, and the other, and continuity had gotten to be quite a mess. And something did need to be done. And I mean, whoever it was that came up with the idea of this, maybe it was Paul Levitz. That sounds like something he might actually have come up with, but, props to him because they were willing to blow up the sandbox and start fresh. And that just had never been done. Nothing like that had ever been attempted. Nothing.
Right.
If you take nothing away from Crisis on Infinite Earths, it's a freaking historic document. It was the first of its kind, and wouldn't be the last of its kind.
No, but, I mean, it's not even finished before Secret Wars starts.
There you go.
Like, that's no coincidence. You have to know that Marvel looked over there across the city and said, hey, what's going on here? We're throwing everybody together for one big event. Villains too. Villains can team up with heroes. Okay. We've got heroes and villains. Let's
bear in mind, though, Secret Wars was explicitly created to sell a toy line.
Right. But the idea absolutely came from Crisis. You will never convince me otherwise. This is the first instance.
I completely agree with that. Although it's interesting, if, I would say as much as 2 years before Crisis #1 actually came out, there's little guest spots throughout various DC books of a shadowy monitor figure watching people. And it just happens kind of here and there, but if you go back and look at all that, it's kind of clear that they didn't quite know what this dude's deal was yet, or who he was, what he was doing. But by God, he was there. And I'm pretty sure I've read, and again, Cody, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I think the seeds for Crisis were planted as far back as like 1982 in terms of editors' rooms. 81 or 82. They spent some serious time building up to this thing.
Well, I mean, you have to, because essentially what they did was end everything.
Yeah.
and start it over, right? So you
Yeah.
can't do that without a plan in place for what comes after. So that means hiring talent for books that you
Unless
haven't
if it's
even
Secret
decided on
Wars.
yet. Right. Well, the thing with Secret Wars is it doesn't change anything. The only thing
Exactly.
that changes, right? Like there's
the
no
illusion
stakes
of
there.
change, but really they just wanted Miles Morales, damn it.
Oh yeah, that one. Yeah, I didn't even read that.
Oh, actually, it's a really good series, but I digress.
Yeah, miss me with that. Yeah, I lost my train of thought. Nick, why don't you jump in?
Yeah, it's interesting to hear you kind of piece together this from an outside perspective, because I said these feel like deep cut characters for me. I understand the concept that these are series at the time. These are what the readers were, enjoying, and this is what they had available. This is not what I bring into it. I'm looking for characters like Blue Beetle is cool to me because I know how it ties into Jaime. So it has a totally different significance. and but it still works, and that's what's so cool. But they take this organizational concept, like you said, and there was something big that had to be done, and I think that scope. But Matt touched on it earlier in saying this is not a character driven story, it's very narrative driven. So I mean, really, just the what it took to approach a story of this scale that way to me is just awesome. We're not relying on a character driven story where we can use these, deep emotions and interactions to drive the story. They're using almost every toy in the chest, which is an analogy I love in comics, that these writers get to take the toy off the shelf or out of the chest and play with it, but they got to put it back so that the next team can come in. And I think this is the ultimate version of that, really. Oh, yeah, there are plenty of shots to be fired.
Bendis breaks the toys. He takes the toys out, he breaks them, and then hands them to the next guy. You're a mess. Here you go, Brubaker. Matt's in jail. Good luck.
Well,
but I feel like
he and Brubaker works that out.
But this story is kind of the epitome of what you can do with that toy chest. This is, like the ultimate representation of the sheer scope of what you can do with those toys and the potential of this type of storytelling and superheroes as a medium or as a genre to do this. And it really is something. Like you said, how do you keep track of this stuff? How does it develop? It's cool to hear like the background on it. Like, yeah, the 3 or 4 issues, we don't know who the Anti-Monitor is, but it's anticipation. They're able to like weave it into the story that it works, but it also follows the development.
Introduces himself as the Monitor.
Yeah,
I know, right? And he never calls himself the Anti-Monitor until the very end.
Yeah, and he just kind of that wording gets sort of gradually co-opted into other people's dialogue throughout the story.
Right.
But that's kind of like a perk you get out of not doing this hard character driven story where it's like you're focusing on Supes, Bats, and Wonder Woman. There's all this huge depth of characters that you're exploring, where there are so many like surprise hits. Like mine was Psycho Pirate, just so cool. Ready for more of that. But there's so much. That's so next on the reading list. But these types of characters are just building blocks almost in the organization of this story, and that's, I think, part of something to really look back on at the success of what this team did and what they're able to do for the future of storytelling with DC Comics. And that's kind of the legacy of it, right? Is that that's the significance of why we want to revisit it and explore it more and its impacts on what we read today, because it's almost always going to be relevant no matter what they do. And I feel like the biggest thing when I was watching DC Universe, they had Sam Humphries on, which is probably my favorite Harley Quinn writer. So good. He was going over, I think it was issue 9 or 10, but they had just gotten past the death of Flash. and they're talking about the decision to structure the story in a way that gives you a 1-2 punch of deaths. And I thought that was just an awesome way to look at it, and really interesting to see the dynamic of what they do in hiding the Flash's death behind the Supergirl one. That when I read through it, I felt like Supergirl's was more emotional. Like I was tied to that character, and I felt like it hit me harder. So when the death of Flash happened, I was just like, "Ooh, that sucks."
Well, yeah, actually, that's a good point. But yeah, because I can imagine being a reader in 1985. I've just read the Supergirl death. There's no way in hell I'm expecting them to also kill the Flash next issue. And now that you bring that up, Walking Dead did the same thing one season. I think around season 5 or 6. They killed Beth, and then the next issue or episode, it was Tyrese.
Oh, yeah.
So
yeah.
that's actually a really interesting point, and one and I bring that up just to say that obviously the formula works if something as massively successful as Walking Dead can feel free to borrow it. And I mean, for what it's worth, Crisis worked. It pulled off its intended goal of reinvigorating the DC universe. I mean, right out of the gate, we get Batman Year One. Well, not right, but almost right out of the gate.
Pretty close,
Batman Year One. It was
John Burns, Man of Steel.
On Superman, Man of Steel.
Yep.
You get, God, so many good comics.
New Teen Titans.
If I can say, I believe there's
2 years later, you get Perez on Wonder Woman.
I think it's 87.
Okay, it's 87. Yeah, okay, so it's like basically right after Crisis then.
Right.
Justice League International kicks off in 88.
Right.
All of these legacy books that we still look back on today with, excuse me, a degree of reverence.
Mm-hmm.
And frankly, they still hold up today. All happened because Crisis gave them the chance to happen. I mean, not for nothing, but Batman Year One is, for my money, the best Batman story ever written. And that's, that's not something I say lightly, but it couldn't have happened without Crisis happening first. And hell, Hawkworld a few years later, if you want to start getting into the weeds with some of the other characters. And,
right.
It didn't quite succeed in straightening out the timeline. There were some contradictions in there that they felt necessitated 0 hour straightening things out and clarifying that in 94. But really, that in and of itself kind of kicked off a cycle of Crisis's legacy of, and this is, maybe not such a positive thing, depending on your perspective, of DC every few years having to, or well, not having, but choosing to reboot their continuity in a certain way. They swore they were done with the multiverse, and then by, I think it was 98 or 99, they introduced Hyper Time.
Oh, call on me. I have commentary on why they had to reinvent the multiverse.
Okay.
If we look at the superhero, the American superhero genre, as the major mythological construct in American history, right? These are our American gods. If you buy into that notion, one of the things that you have to consider is how important it is that these gods exist in a way that we can have access to them while still at a remove, right? Similar to Homer writing, Achilles and Artemis into the Iliad, right? There's a connection there, but it's obviously still the gods are at a remove. We don't really have access to them. The multiverse provides us with that access. We can look at it as if our gods exist in a universe in a shared structure with our universe, right? And that's why Superboy Prime was such an intriguing character, because he was essentially our universe getting its first superhero. So all that said, when they do away with the multiverse in 1985, 1986, we're in a period where the social necessity for these gods and myths is at an all-time low, right? if we operate under the assumption that the reason that we have myths, the reason that we have gods, is to serve a social need, 1938 and the invention of the American superhero obviously makes sense. 1956, on the just post Korean War and on the brink of the Vietnam War or conflict, or however you want to phrase it, makes sense that superheroes are getting reinvigorated, they're getting reintegrated into our national consciousness. What we see post Vietnam is a slow decline of the necessity of the superhero. So by the time they sever that link, by the time they destroy the multiverse in 1985, there's really kind of no need for the superhero at that point. And that's why when we get into the 90s, we start seeing Superman's dead, Batman's broken, Hal loses his damn mind and kills the core, right? You've got this great moment of basically the death of the superhero. The Americans didn't need a superhero anymore. We didn't have major conflict. The conflicts that we did have were well in hand. Bosnia and Serbia, and the Gulf War won, the 100-Hour War.
We had Youngblood and Spawn, damn it.
So we get Youngblood and Spawn. We get the Authority. We get Planetary. We get all these movements away from what the traditional superhero had been right up until September 11th. And at that moment, everything changes. At that moment, superhero comics start selling again. After all the bankruptcies and the bubble burst and all of that, sales start to spike. And all of a sudden, here we start putting things into motion to have Infinite Crisis, which spawns the multiverse again in 2005. 2004? Somewhere in that range, right? Like, none of this is a coincidence. I mean, maybe it's a little bit coincidence, but also I think it's a product of our national discourse and national mindset and social constructs that we've built around the superhero. So I don't remember where I was going with that, but this is one of my absolute most favorite subjects, so I'd really like to talk about it. And this is a really good avenue for me to get to talk about it.
I think that was incredible. A whole timeline of the prominence of the superhero concept with American discourse is just incredible. I think to tie it to real world social events like that, and a way for us to explore those dynamics and how to express those feelings, and how it comes. All that boils into Crisis, like to make that jump, but it's there. The importance of it and how it develops, and I think that ties into the heart of the success of the story too.
Yeah, it's all about timing. Like, how these things land and how these things sustain is very much so about timing.
And that's why we call him the professor. Damn, I don't even know how to follow that up.
Remarkable.
Comics good. I'm sort of speechless, but that's definitely right on the mark, and it definitely fulfills the narrative that comics are a reflection of their time. It's interesting, leaning into your timeline there a little bit more. I think it's interesting that it was 1999, just before 9/11, that you really see the absolute inverse of the DC superhero in The Authority. And it sold like wildfire until 9/11. And, damn.
I think
it stopped me cold.
Because towards the end of Crisis, there's a line where they talk about these worlds being destroyed, or these Earths being destroyed. And somebody, I forget who it was, says that it wasn't destruction, it was a rebirth. And I remember thinking to myself, so clever, because that explains a lot of Jeff Johns' awesome rebirth stuff, right? Like, but it also is something a lot deeper than that. Like, with that explanation, this rebirth and what it means for the superhero genre and what you can do with it and how it ties into social relations is incredible. in what you get out of rebirth in its timeline in our discourse now.
Well, and I'll say this, and to get us kind of up to modern times, is the and I'll just call it the Crisis phenomenon, has happened now so many times in the DC universe in the intervening years since this series concluded that you can really say that it is a feature, not a bug, to the point, and Cody and I are going to talk a lot more about this in about 2 weeks, that in Doomsday Clock, we now have the Prime Earth as a metaverse, whereupon the things that happen there are ripple effect, butterfly affected throughout the entirety of the multiverse. And that is kind of the ultimate legacy, I think, of Crisis on Infinite Earths, is the impermanence of permanent change. And if that doesn't sound too pretentious, DC is just built of all these different blocks, some of which fit together and some of which don't, but they're all part of the same sandbox. And that sandbox gets blown up every so often, and sometimes you get the New 52, and sometimes you get 0 Hour, and sometimes you get Hyper Time, which doesn't get leaned into very much at all and is eventually discarded, and sometimes you get Rebirth and Dr. Manhattan, but all the core concept always remains that DC is this grand experiment, this huge melting pot, as it were, of various characters and universes, and they all come together. And if that's not an apt metaphor for the United States and America, I don't know what is. So DC is America. Boom. Thank you for your service, Cody. Guys, I mean, we've definitely gone over our usual allotted time, not by a whole hell of a lot, but do you have any final thoughts on Crisis and its legacy? I mean, shoot, well, heck, we didn't even get into the TV show that's coming up, but hold on to your hats, because we got Brandon Routh as the Kingdom Come Superman, and that's really all I needed to get me in there.
Right.
Kevin Conroy coming in as Bruce. You got to watch the trailer to see what he looks like in it. Oh my gosh.
Yes. Black Lightning's going to interact with the rest of the Arrowverse at long last.
One of the things I think is brilliant about the CW doing this right now is the way that they have built. It's almost as if they have always planned on having Crisis at some point. Like, when you keep Ruby Rose off in one universe, when you keep Kara off in another one, when you keep Jefferson Pierce off in another one, it's almost like they're experiments waiting to see if they work. And then once you get to a point where you have 3 Earths that need to be integrated into our Earth 1 and 2, there's our 5 Earths, there's our Earth X, it's not the same Earths, but it is a similar concept. We have 5, now they must be integrated. I think that's
a good observation, because they kept having to bend over backwards to find reasons to get Supergirl into Earth over to Earth 1.
Just like the Earth 2 heroes in Justice League and Flash during the multiple crisis.
And that's actually interesting. And I think it's, we can speculate a whole hell of a lot as to what the Arrowverse is going to look like post-Crisis. I wouldn't be surprised. I was originally thinking that they were grooming Roy to take over as the new lead on Arrow, but I actually don't think that anymore, because I feel like they're spending an awful lot of time developing the kids on Arrow.
Yeah, well, they've already announced that.
Oh, what, they did?
Yeah, Mia, Dinah, and Laurel have a series coming out called The Canaries.
I had no idea. Well, there you go.
What?
No, I completely missed that.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's happening.
Well,
that was
thank
like
you.
2 months ago or so they started talking about that.
Well, damn. Thanks for stealing my thunder and letting me not look like a fool in the process.
I do have to bring up a question.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I would love to ask. I couldn't help but find myself making these comparisons while reading Crisis, and what characters the CW is going to use in which role. And I know we got Harbinger already showed up. I don't want to
Right.
spoiler too much. But
Well, it's her name. Lila Michaels is her name.
yeah,
Like,
but
she-
people not catching up. I don't know. I don't know if people know when they show up in the story. The big thing is who's gonna die. The 1-2 punch that I talked about earlier, that's gonna happen, right?
Yeah.
Like that's such a fundamental aspect of the story. Are we gonna get that 1-2 punch of deaths where one's really
Well,
gonna stick?
They
Who do you
did a
think?
bait and switch playing fans' emotions last year during the crossover, where they made it look like Supergirl and Flash were both racing to their individual deaths in the climax, and then of course it didn't happen. So if they went back to the well and went ahead and followed comics and killed both those characters, I mean they're not killing Supergirl. The Flash this season has actually been quite a downer because it's been all about Barry moping around about his upcoming death. So I would actually, on the one hand, like to see them move past that. But on another, I think it'd be really interesting and incredibly ballsy if they did go ahead and kill the Flash and then had Wally, or Wallace, I should say, step into that role just like in comics.
Yeah.
That would be a game changer. And frankly, I think it would be the shot in the arm the Flash needs right now as a show. Oh,
Yeah.
Cody,
we will
about
see.
you?
Another aspect is you got Ryan Choi as the Atom getting introduced during the
Right.
crossover, and we know Brandon Routh is leaving Legends of Tomorrow, so I don't think it's a huge leap of logic to say that Ozark Chow is probably joining the cast of Legends as the new Atom.
Right.
True. But doesn't it feel? I feel like Arrow is primed to be in that spot of Flash dying. His series is ending.
Right.
Do you just kill him off for
Nah,
an emotional
does he get a
impact?
big heroic death, or does he eventually get to be reunited with Felicity and he gets a happy ending?
Yeah.
I'm torn as to which way I want to go on that.
He gets the Lois and Clark of Earth 2 along with Superboy Prime and Alexander Luthor treatment, I think. I think he ends up in an alternate, pocket dimension, waiting to be brought out of the toy box when they need him. But he gets the perfect life. He gets to go off to paradise without being killed off on screen. That's my speculation right now. I mean, we already saw the Monitor escort Felicity into it.
Okay,
True.
interesting.
But if you take that out, like who is going to be the emotional death? Like, I don't believe that's not going to happen in this
No,
series.
I think it's going to be Barry. I
Yeah, just-
100% think that they're going to kill Barry. I think that Grant Gustin is going to dye his hair red, and he's going to become the other Wally West. Not Wallace West, but Wally West.
The real Wally.
And carry on
My Wally.
as Kid Flash taking over the mantle of Flash. I know it sounds crazy, but I've been
Yeah.
watching the CW for a real long time now. This is not crazy for the CW. This is absolutely par for the course. I believe it with all my heart that we will kill Barry, replace him with Wally, and it will still be Grant Gustin.
Interesting.
Remember that time we killed Henry Allen and then replaced him with Jay Garrick, who is the same actor?
Yeah.
Remember that time we killed Harrison Wells like 16 times and
16
kept
times?
replacing him with the same character?
A one-trick
true.
pony that has been beaten to death? Yes.
I have loved every single one of them. You shut your mouth.
But would that
I'm
really
not
work
in
for
love with
this?
Nash
Like,
Wells yet.
It would
But
totally work. It would totally work.
Those are good observations. Those are really good observations. Man. Yeah, but Crisis on Infinite Earth starts this Sunday, December 8th. I know I will be there. And we might have to do a little recap on the show next week just so we can catch our breath.
And
Don't
while
know.
you're getting ready to watch Crisis on Infinite Earths on the CW, on Sunday morning, you can check out, I'm going to put together a Sunday Classics version of a review of Crisis on Infinite Earths. A lot of the stuff you already heard, maybe some stuff that you haven't. So that'll be coming out on the website at www.comic-watch.com Sunday morning. And then once Crisis is finished, you'll see my full review of the crossover as a whole, probably 2 to 3 days after it wraps up, also at comicwatch.com.
Ooh, free plugs. I love it. Gentlemen, I think this has probably been one of the strongest episodes we've ever done. Thank you so much, but I'm not quite done with either of you yet. Because we still have to talk about what you've been reading and what you're looking forward to this week. What? I know. Nick,
I've been
what do you got?
reading Crisis, and I'm looking forward to Crisis on the CW.
Well,
It's so hard not to
okay, you're done. Thanks. People listening still.
Right. It's hard. It is difficult not to say Crisis but to be fair, I read Crisis and I do my homework and then I have dessert. I've been reading a lot of Batgirl, catching up on that. And this comes after reading a lot of X-Men, so making that swap, I'm still following up on a lot of different X-Men stuff. But I caught up on Batgirl's Rebirth run and really cool stuff. And then I went back to Batman Eternal and forgot how much I loved that series with Scott Snyder and Tinian. Just really freaking cool stuff. I read that whole series. Just
Eternal killed it.
and I forget. I'm supposed to be reading a lot of Batgirl stuff, but she's in the story. I mean, she's a fundamental part of it. But man, Batman Eternal was great.
That is bar none one of the best first issues I've ever read. Ever. Yeah.
Yeah.
It just.
I mean, it impacts Batgirl in the Rebirth run now because Bard's a reoccurring character and
Yeah. Absolutely.
he's still trying to like make up for what's going on. And I was like, what exactly was it that was going on? Because it's been a little bit. So then I go back, I'm like, oh man. So this is, the strength of the whole Batman Eternal run really is on that event. And really, really cool stuff. What I'm looking forward to, there's a new Ghost Rider #3 happening next week. Really excited for that one to come out. Let's see, DC has Harley Quinn and Poison Ivy #4. Really into that run. There's a lot of Harley Quinn, eh? There's also the Harley Quinn Year of the Villain #1 happening. And really cool stuff because that coincides with the release of the animated series Harley Quinn on DC Universe, which, we're past the minute intro, was fucking awesome. Like, cursing, violence, lots of world building, plays with the DC characters you had no idea. Gordon was the funniest character in the first episode. He's just crazy, like high strung and really frazzled all the time and just like yelling and kind of tense. And they just pull it off in such a way that is just awesome, hilarious. Like I want to see more of that. And I think they're doing cool things with the character. Like I had no idea what to expect out of that series, but it is very adult. Don't let your kids watch it. It's hyper adult stuff. Like,
okay.
Within the first 30 seconds, you're gonna be like, oh man, like just straight gore, straight cursing, lots of F-bombs. It is Black Label material.
Weird. Okay. Well, I'll have to check it out. One of these days, I'll get the DC Universe streaming service. So, Cody, do you have anything other than Crisis?
Tom Taylor's Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man #14 finally comes out. That'll be the final issue of this run, as far as I understand. I've looked at the solicits all the way through February of next year, and there's no other listings. In the way that #13 kind of started tying up storylines, it seems pretty clear that they're getting ready to end the book. So I'm looking forward to that, but I'm not looking forward to that because it's the best Spider-Man book I've read in probably 30 years, maybe ever. So that's a shame. Marvel really shit the bed on that one, but we get Tom Taylor and Suicide Squad, so it's all right.
Yes. Well, I've been reading, if you want to go back into DC 80s Maxi series, Camelot 3000 from Mike W. Barr and Brian Holland. Never had read it before. It holds up unbelievably well for a early to mid 80s comic. I could not put this thing down, and it wasn't just for the beautiful art. Tore ass through it and just reading every chance I could get for about 2.5 days, and I got through it, and I just loved it. Please, the hype is real on Camelot 3000. You can generally find it in dollar bins. do yourself a favor and buy this damn thing. I'm going to go a little left field on what I'm looking forward to. And I'm calling out Detective Comics number 1017 because Tom Taylor is writing this issue.
Right.
Oh, yes. It might be a fill-in, but Tomasi's run has been a little so far. Not up to his usual standards anyway. So, Tom Taylor, I hope this is actually a tryout issue, and maybe it will lead to more Batman by him. Either way, it's a good break from what we've been getting, and by God, Tom Taylor rarely misses. So that's it. That's my big thing I'm looking forward to reading. So, guys, thank you both. Thank you, Cody, for taking time to stop in and wax philosophic with us on Crisis on Infinite Earths ahead of the big to-do this Sunday. This has been episode 56. Thank you of the Comic Watchers Show. Thank you for listening. Comic Watchers Show is a part of comic-watch.com. Pro news and reviews written by fans for fans. Thank you so much for listening. We'll be back next week.